Hi, I'm Elizabeth with Israeli Good Wine. Today we're going to talk about wine additives, what makes a clean wine, and why Israel is maybe not what you'd expect. Let's start out with the elephant in the room. Things get added to wine all of the time. With the exception of one winemaker that I know near ancient Shiloh in Israel who literally takes his grapes directly off the vine, crushes them, and sticks them in a bottle, most winemakers have a process to their product and a method to their magic. The bottom line, not all wine additives are bad, but many are surprising, and here at Israeli Good Wine, we're big sticklers that we only want to bring you the best wine, and that includes wines that are high quality, not pumped with extra junk, and reflecting the beauty and fruit of the land. So let's talk about what's normal around the world. Regardless of where the grapes are grown or what governing bodies overseeing wine production, by and large, it's fairly common that winemakers in various regions are going to do three things during production to help the wine actually become wine. For a good winemaker who really cares about their wines, these are used only on an as-needed basis as a last resort. The first is chaptalization, which is when sugar is added at the time of fermentation, just after the grapes are pressed and before it's bottled or barreled. This will usually happen if you have grapes that were picked too early and are underripe, so there's not enough natural sugars to help turn the natural yeast into alcohol. Because winemaking 101, sugar eats the yeast and that creates the alcohol that turns grape juice into wine. So even though chaptalization adds sugar, it's not meant to sweeten a wine. It's simply meant to give the yeast enough fuel to turn it into alcohol. So the second thing is kind of like the opposite of sugar. It's acid, usually tartaric acid or malic acid. Acidification is commonly recognized practice of adding acids to balance a wine. This will usually happen if you have grapes that were picked too late and are overripe. When the fruit is overripe, it can produce wines with low acidity and a high pH, which can cause the wine to be unstable, and it'll produce off flavors and deteriorate pretty quickly. Thus, acidification is needed to stabilize a flabby wine. Basically, when grapes are harvested is and should be really important to a winemaker. Case in point, if you pick too early, the acids are usually too high, sugars are too low, and the tannins are too green. Pick it too late and your sugars will be too high. Either one of these too much scenarios would result in the winemaker needing to add something to balance out the wine. This is why it's really key to choose wines from winemakers who don't just know what they're doing, but they really care about when the fruit is harvested. Many commercial wines in the market use grapes that aren't grown by the winery or by the winemaker who creates the wine. They just bought their fruit from some other guy and they have no control over when the grapes were picked for that varietal and that vintage. But the winemakers that we work with at Israeli Good Wine, even the larger wineries, they take care that their fruit is good. It's picked at the right time, and for many of our boutique and family-owned wineries, the grapes are not only sampled and picked at peak time, but they're hand harvested, so the fermentation process doesn't begin too early, and the wine is absolutely top quality. But enough about sugars and acids. The third additive that can be commonly used is sulfur. Sulfur can be added when a winemaker needs to stop the fermentation at a specific point to move the winemaking process to a different phase, like aging or clarifying. And this one can get a bad rap because everyone complains about sulfites and how they can give headaches. Listen, I'm not dismissing that, but let's add some clarification here. Sulfites are found naturally on grapes, and all wines are gonna have some naturally produced sulfites created during the winemaking process. This is totally normal. There is about 1% of the population that truly does have a sensitivity to sulfites. That's real. However, wine has far less sulfur in it than many other natural products. For instance, it typically has about 150 parts per million of sulfur added to a wine, whereas dried fruit has 1,000 parts per million. Quite a big difference. Sulfites are used to kill unwanted bacteria and yeasts in the winemaking process. Beyond the naturally occurring sulfites from the grapes themselves, if sulfur is added, it's done in small amounts at the beginning of fermentation and prior to bottling. Since 1987, American producers have been required to mention the presence of sulfur if it exceeds 10 parts per million in the finished wine. The EU recently passed a similar labeling law in 2005. And one of the requirements for a wine to be considered organic in the United States by the USDA is that no additional sulfites can be added beyond the naturally occurring ones. So if you're a part of the 1% of the population that has a sensitivity to sulfites, you're gonna know it. You know how? You'll also have a sensitivity to foods like French fries, cured meats, cheese, and canned soup. Some of our no added sulfite or vegan wines are a great option for you. Most of the time, the wine headache isn't caused from sulfites, but from the other chemicals used in production or from just low quality wines. And let's be honest, we've done the legwork to make sure that that's not what we have at Israeli Good Wine. Okay, So that's what's considered normal or common. Let's talk about where things have gone crazy with additives. Regardless if a wine is considered organic or it's super obscure, most of the additives that might be used on a wine are going to fall into one of 5 categories during the winemaking process: antioxidants, tannins, acidifiers and deacidifiers, clarifying agents, and stabilizers. Let's take a look at some of the surprising things that could be in your conventional glass of wine at a restaurant or on the grocery store shelves. Antioxidants, like sulfites, might be added before, during, or after fermentation. Antioxidants help to prevent the wine from going bad through premature aging or oxidation. So adding antioxidants can take the form of something like ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C, sulfur dioxide, potassium bisulfate, or potassium metabisulfate. For the record, it's routine that we ask our winemakers if or when they're using extra acids and antioxidants in their wines, and we also screen the wines past human chemical detectors to ensure that we're only bringing wines that won't cause reactions to the majority of drinkers. Another set of additives that might be used at fermentation include active dry yeast, thiamine, enzymes, and even white sugar. We talked about why yeast or sugars might be added and needed, but there's a darker side of this that no one in the industry here in the West wants to talk about that you use when you can't use sugar. It's called mega purple. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, before I was almost exclusively drinking Israeli wine, I was drinking a wine from a common wine region here in the United States that will not be named. It was a Cabernet Sauvignon and the vintage was young. So what should I have expected was a pretty fruit-forward wine with a normal medium or dark red color. It's about a $20 bottle, so not super expensive, but not a cheap wine. Or so I thought. I remember opening the bottle and pouring a glass. The wine was so dark that it was almost black. It tasted really balanced and almost sweet, and I did a second take to see what vintage the bottle was, and it was the same year I was in. So this was a young wine that tasted like it had been aged a while. I couldn't believe the discrepancy from what I knew and expected of a good wine and the color, clarity, and taste and smell this wine was giving to me. It was pleasant enough to drink, so I had a glass, but I was really confused. The next day, my body reacted to that wine so badly that I was concerned enough I thought about calling my doctor. Instead, I did a good old internet search, and this is when I discovered the unspoken additive, mega purple. It's legal and it's perfectly normal that a winemaker, or more commonly a large corporate wine company here in the United States, is going to add fruit or grape juices to their processes in order to add the sugars needed for fermentation. In fact, in certain states, California, the state or region restricts the addition of sugars. So they get around this by going with federal law that allows them to add grape juice. But the grape juice that they add is called mega purple. Mega Purple is a grape juice concentrate by the Vidal company in Fresno, California. It is used as a food additive to color correct wines. It smooths out flavors, masks certain natural aromas, and keeps a wine product, especially the name brand popular ones that get cult followings, the same year over year. This additive is made from ruby red grapes, which is an extremely vibrant grape that has both red skin and red flesh, which is why it's able to impart such a deep color. To prepare it, the grapes are made into a type of juice that's extremely high in sugar. It's roughly 68% sugar. Mega Purple is so powerful, however, that when it's used, it can only be used in very low amounts because just a couple of drops in a glass of water will turn the water inky black. Mega Purple and its cousin, Ultra Red, are used when winemakers want to add color to a wine because they think it's more visually attractive to the consumer, but it's also used to mellow out some of the naturally occurring vegetal aromas and flavors like green pepper, give the wine a sweeter finish, and make each wine a little bit more uniform instead of the beautiful variety that comes from each vintage changing naturally. While the use of Mega Purple is more prevalent in cheap wines, you can actually find its use throughout the wine world. But it's especially common in domestic wines. Finding a winemaker who will admit to using it, however, is difficult because winemakers are worried that people are going to think they're using Mega Purple to improve a wine made from less than superior grapes, which isn't necessarily true. But if you weren't aware, winemakers are really touchy when it comes to the quality of their grapes. So good news for you. Now that I've told you all about Mega Purple, our wines don't have Mega Purple at Israeli Good Wine, so no worries there. Other additives. Some more that we could talk about. After a wine has been freshly fermented, it's going to go through a period of stabilization. So there's some additives in this process. They're designed to pull unwanted characteristics out of the wine. These things don't end up in the finished product, but they may be part of the process. For many hundreds of years in Italy and France, winemakers would add an egg white or two to a large barrel of wine. The proteins in the egg white would bind to free proteins suspended in the wine. After a short wait, the egg white and free proteins would precipitate out of the wine and drop to the bottom of the barrel. Winemakers would strain the clear wine off the top and leave the sludge. This process is called fining and racking. Nowadays, there are more advanced ways of achieving the same results, including numerous microbial products, totally vegetarian, that perform the same function. Some additives that might help with clarifying wine are commonly used in addition to egg whites, and they might include tannins, like from the seeds and skins of the grapes, bentonite clay, food-grade gelatin, milk products, and some others that are less appealing, like protease enzymes from bovine pancreas or stomachs, isinglass from fish bladder, or chitosan, also known as the fiber extracted from the outer shell of shrimp. Personally, no thank you. A few other additives you might see have to do with balancing out flavors and taste profiles. These can include oak chips, which are an alternative to barrel aging and might get added directly to the wine, or copper sulfate. Yep, like as in pennies. Like they're used to correct bad aromas and taste from hydrogen sulfide and its derivatives. So if these are all the crazy things that can get added, how are you supposed to know if these are in your wines? Well, you can't ever really totally be sure of anything, but also you start to have a pretty good idea of good quality clean wines and the ones that just, well, aren't that good. And here's where trust comes in. If you know who is making your wine, it goes a long way in being able to know what they're putting into their wines. We know the vast majority of the winemakers at Israeli Good Wine, and questions about additives, what is or isn't added before, during, and after the winemaking process is extremely important to us. But also, let's just take a step back and look at why Israeli wines in general are different than wines in other parts of the world. Many of the winemakers in Israel, both kosher and non-kosher, are purists when they approach the winemaking process. This is in part because for Jews, wine is sacred. This is true for not only religious Jews, but even within the Jewish ethnicity, wine is valued highly, and so their motivation is unto having wine that brings life. Unlike many other winemaking parts of the world, especially the New World wine regions in the West, money is not their main motivator for why Israelis make wine. Instead, it's an integral part of their faith, their culture, and their view of life. Instead of undercutting the quality of the wine by stretching it or by using excess additives, Israelis would rather have better wine, even if it costs a bit more or there's less commercially available. For the most part, unlike how we often are in Europe and in the United States, Israelis would rather drink less but have the wine be really good. Another reason why Israeli wine is different is simply because the regulations are stricter. In the US, a federal agency oversees how the wines are made and what can and can't be done. In Europe, there's EU regulations as well as specific qualifications for places like Bordeaux to ensure the wines are up to their standard. But in Israel, this isn't the centralized Israeli government that sets the standard, but rather the kosher laws. Kosher comes from the word that means fit, and it simply means that food or wine has been prepared in a manner that is fit for consumption based on the Jewish dietary laws, the kashrut. There are a few different ways that wines may be designated as kosher, which we can talk about another time. But all kosher wines have to be certified and approved by a rabbi or prepared in a certain way. The majority of our wines are kosher, and many are kosher for Passover, which means that in addition to the basic kosher regulations, it didn't come into contact with anything with leaven. Some differences between a kosher wine and a non-kosher wine is that a kosher wine is handled only by religious Jews during the winemaking, and there's no animal-based additives used during the winemaking. For some winemakers, they'll allow for egg whites to be used for clarifying, but because of these kosher requirements, an added bonus is that many kosher wines, including the ones from Jezreel Valley Winery and Tishbe Estate Winery, are also vegan wines. They ensure that no animal products like gelatin, casein, or elements from shellfish are being used as additives. In fact, all of the additive requirements are stricter with kosher wines. And again, even though not all Israeli wines are kosher, the culture of Israel's food and wine scene is heavily influenced by both the religious and ethnic aspects of Jewish culture and life, so the purity and spirit behind kosher law carries over even to the wineries that don't produce designated kosher wines, but they still approach it with authenticity and sacredness. To honor our members who keep kosher, we're very clear to designate when a wine is kosher and non-kosher. One of the things we're really passionate about at Israeli Good Wine is not just having great tasting wines in our collection, but having great quality wines. It's really hard for the average consumer to know what's in the bottle when they're shopping the grocery store aisle, or even when you're getting a wine in a restaurant or a wine shop where someone is serving them good wine and making recommendations. Is the wine truly good quality, or does it just look and taste pretty good? Unless you're used to tasting a lot of wine, it's hard for the average consumer to know. But because we're so passionate about bringing quality wines and knowing our winemakers who make them, that's why we spend time scouting all across Israel. We take time with the winemakers personally, we ask them questions, we taste hundreds of wines each year, and we bring wines back to the States for sommeliers to try. In fact, one of our sommeliers is so talented that he can discern if a wine is made with grapes that were handpicked. We're picky because it matters. If a wine isn't up to our standards, we don't carry it, even if we think it might taste good or it's unique. We work with trusted wineries and winemakers who we know will have quality wines. Some of our favorite winemakers who create vegan wines include Jezreel Valley and Tishbe. We carry Or HaGanuz, which is also vegan friendly and has no added sulfites. And we're proud to have imported to the US for the very first time one of the only certified organic wineries in Israel, Lotem Organic Winery, and their wines are exclusive to us at Israeli Good Wine here in the US. Wine is subjective. Each person has different preferences and palates, and what's good to you might not be the same thing that's good to me. So I can't guarantee you that you, or even I, will love every wine, but I can tell you that the quality of the wines from Israeli Good Wine is one of our highest priorities, and it's a high value. And that's why we care about what's in your glass and how it got there. So let's raise a toast to clean Israeli wine. L'chaim.